Hello and welcome to the Kids Are Childfree podcast. Today, you've got just me. We're doing a solo episode, as promised a couple of episodes ago, that we're going to be doing a bit of a debrief. I was inspired to share some thoughts off the back of my conversation with Astrid Hurault de Ligney. Once again, apologies for my atrocious French. I do my best. She was on for episode 42, where we talked about her experience with regretting motherhood, the book that she wrote. This is a French book, Le Regret Maternel. I did have a few of you ask me, is this available in English? No, it is not as of yet. Again, if anyone in the publishing world is listening and wants to help Astrid get her book published in English, please connect with her. So when we had this conversation, I just felt like there was so much more that perhaps needed to be said, so many thoughts going through my mind. I was also really curious how all of you were going to receive this episode, because as I shared in my conversation with Astrid, the last thing I wanted it to be was a scary conversation that gave even more concern that you too could regret having a child. I know that regret is something that many of us have to contend with, this fear of regret, the threat of regret, as I call it, when we're making the kids or child-free decision. Namely, we worry that we will regret our choice, no matter what that is. Of course, if we are thinking about the child-free path, we know there are many people out there who will tell us that we will greatly and gravely regret not having children. And then if we have kids, gosh, what a scary thing to think about regretting having children. So this was like first conversation we had where we talked about regretting motherhood. And I'm once again just so grateful to Astrid for coming on. So again, today's sharing some of the feedback I received from all of you, as well as a few of my own thoughts to just sort of help me process what I heard. All right, so it's funny because I do these solo episodes periodically, and it is somehow so much harder to think I'm going to sit here and just talk for the next 15 or 20 plus minutes. I've really gotten used to having these wonderful conversations with our guests. So let's see how I do today. What I'm trying to tell you is I feel sort of nervous, more so than if I was chatting with one of my lovely guests. All right, so one of the things that was interesting and that stood out to me in my conversation with Astrid is that as she shares, there was never really a true questioning of her decision. Because like so many of you, this was just something that she expected to do. It was something that she was told she would do, maybe not in as many words, but this sort of attitude or idea of, when you become a mom someday, when you have kids of your own. And so her and her husband were both really just like, yeah, okay, it's time. Let's have a child. And of course, there are many people who proceed that way in having kids or having a child. And they don't feel regretful about having children. They don't express the feelings that Astrid shared in our conversation. But I do think it's worth noting that just the fact that you are questioning this decision, that is giving you pause. I know being in ambivalence, being in uncertainty is a really tough place to be in, but I want to congratulate you for the fact that you are trying to be really intentional and deliberate about this decision, and hopefully are thinking about some of the different factors that Astrid and I talk about in our conversation. And again, if you haven't listened to my conversation with Astrid, I'm not going to be sharing any audio clips of our conversation. And this episode is going to have a lot more relevance if you go back and listen to my chat with her. Again, that's episode 42 of the podcast. So 2 episodes back. So I did think, yes, it's noteworthy that it wasn't really questioned. She, of course, says things like, I knew it would be challenging. I knew that I wouldn't have sleep. But at the same time, she didn't know how hard it would be. And I think this is very relatable in the sense that we can never really know exactly what it's going to be like, how hard it will be, and specifically how hard it will be for us, because as Astrid and I talk about, we change through motherhood, and it's also hard to know how our own personality and temperament, our own background, our relationship will necessarily fare when we have a child. Now, something that came up in my conversation with one of you was just how much this piece around expectations of motherhood stood out for them in the conversation. And I think it's hard not to have any expectations whatsoever, because usually when we make a choice, it's because we expect, or at least hope it to be, to feel like, to look a certain way. But for her, she said that really stood out to her. And she said she's actually a new mother. this woman who was listening to the episode, and she shared that, she's trying not to have really any expectations going in terms of how it's going to be, what her child is going to be like as far as crying, sleepless nights, etc. And although I think it's hard, I do think that if we can try and drop particular expectations and to question any expectations we might have, that can be helpful. And this is actually it's an exercise that we do in my Kids Are Child-Free workshop for those of you who've joined for one of these workshops. If not, be sure to check out the details. I'll make sure to link to it in the show notes of today's episode. But in our workshops, we talk about the assumptions that we might be making as far as what our child might be like, what our relationship with our child could be like, what we expect parenthood or motherhood to be like. And I think it's important that we question our assumptions and their validity, whether those assumptions are positive or negative, right? So sometimes we assume that it's going to be terrible and overwhelming and we might hate it. And I hear from a lot of women actually who had been really afraid about parenthood that actually it's not been nearly as terrible as they thought it might be. They're actually quite enjoying it. And conversely, sometimes we have such a romanticized view of motherhood that we then have the idea that, it won't be so bad, or there's going to be a lot more that we'll love about it. And then if that's not the case, that can also let us down. So I don't think, talking to Astrid, that she necessarily had the wrong set of expectations. And that was something else that came up in my conversation with this listener I referenced, that there are no wrong expectations, right? We expect or hope for what we hope for. But it was interesting or noteworthy that even though she knew it would be challenging, she didn't quite know it would be this way. She talked about the challenges she had with breastfeeding, and specifically because her son was intolerant to dairy, the sleepless nights, obviously the hospital visit that she talks about. Those are things we cannot expect to experience, but they sound like they understandably hit her in a really hard way. One of the other big things that came through in my conversation with Astrid, and I have to say, this was probably the through line through the whole conversation. And she states it in as many terms when she talks about, she said, if it were not for the mental load of motherhood, I don't think I would regret motherhood. But support was such a big thing in this conversation, and just how much she and her husband really grappled with their different roles. Astrid being at home for those early months, feeling like she was the one who intimately knew their son and really could attend to him in a way that her husband couldn't. And despite his efforts, like feeling like she was that primary default parent, and just how much pressure that created for her and how difficult that was. Now, the piece around support has a happy ending in the sense that Astrid and her husband have been working a lot on their relationship, on their parenting together. She says they've really become a team together. And this was something that I thought was a happy outcome, despite the fact she still has this feeling of, I wouldn't choose this path again if given the choice, that things are going seemingly a lot better and they continue to work on their relationship. And now they're also doing family therapy, which I thought was really interesting. And I think, I'm a huge proponent of therapy. I've probably shared this on the podcast before. I don't think that getting support through becoming a parent, and frankly, through this decision, through planning for having a child, and likewise through planning your child-free life, like if that's the path you choose, I don't think it can ever do us wrong. I just think it's so helpful to be working on ourselves. And if you have a partner who is willing to do that as well, which this is also something that came up in the conversation, the initial resistance that Astrid's husband had. I think if you have a partner who's willing to say, yeah, let's work on ourselves, let's work on us as parents, let's work on us as a child-free couple, whatever it may be, that can make such a big difference. Now, I've already sort of hinted at it, but something that came through in this conversation with Astrid, which I knew knowing a little bit about her story going into it, but I think this is something that was interesting for a lot of you, is the fact that she doesn't say, I regret my son. She doesn't say, I wish, she says, it's not like I wish he were dead. It's not that I don't love him. Conversely, she loves him deeply. She, he's a great joy in her life in so many ways, but it's this role of being a mom and what that has meant for her that has really been challenging. And I love that throughout our conversation, she just debunks this narrative that regretting motherhood or regretting your child, as it's often framed, you're not actually regretting your child and saying, I wish my child weren't here. There may be some instances of women or parents who feel this way, but I think in the vast majority of cases, and certainly almost all of the instances I've heard about, either personally or sort of anecdotally or in books, it's that I regret taking on the role of being a mom. I regret having children in the sense that, that has made me a mother, and I don't really love being a mom, but it doesn't mean that you don't love your kids and you wish they weren't here. Something that I found really interesting, and this is something that Astrid and I touched on to a degree, but like the intersection of really complicated, heavy circumstances that I think convened that have probably been feeding into the sense of, I wish I hadn't chosen this. She talks about having lost not one, but two jobs. One of them at least was directly linked to the pandemic. Of course, she is having a new child and raising this child in the early days and throughout the pandemic. Very challenging, no doubt. She talks about the relationship with her parents and the challenges around her own upbringing. And so it seems in many ways that this is sort of a perfect storm. That, of course, I'm sure, certainly Astrid couldn't, and none of us can anticipate, like, hello, global pandemic. None of us probably, maybe someone called that one. I know I didn't. We can't anticipate losing our job. We can't anticipate necessarily how our past childhood experiences as being a child can impact this. But all of these things, of course, she had the hospital visit with the son. She had the issues around feeding and his intolerances. These things, I can see how, like, when you bring those together, it's like, holy moly, it's enough to derail a person. And although she's come to the realization that although she had dealt with postpartum depression and anxiety, this regretting feeling is something much deeper. Certainly, that was another factor as well. I think it's sort of the confluence of these different factors that have fed into this experience. Now, on this topic of Astrid's own family upbringing, she comments in the episode that many of the women who've reached out to her since starting her Le Regret Maternel Instagram account, as well as writing the book by the same name, that they also talk about this being a factor, and that their own difficult upbringing, sometimes traumatic upbringings, difficult relationships with parents, it seems to play into this sense of regretting having a child or children. Now, I think we need to be I guess a little bit cautious with interpreting that if you've had a traumatic upbringing or if you've had a difficult relationship with your parent or parents, that it will necessarily lead to a sense of maternal regret. Because I know there are many people who feel that Astrid actually says the words in the episode, it's like a bandage on my heart to be able to give her son the things that she didn't have, which I thought was, kind of beautiful, profound language, but that understates the fact that there has been healing for her in having a child, despite the fact that she has these feelings of regret, which, I understand there's like a contradiction and a tension there. But at the same time, again, both her and a lot of the women they speak with talk about that they feel like their regret has something to do with their past upbringing, their past experiences with their parents. And, I guess the main thing to take away from this is that, of course, we don't ultimately know how these past experiences will affect us, our decision, and how we feel about our own parenthood path, should we choose to have kids or kid in Astrid's case. And perhaps many of you will only have one child if you go that way. But I do think it's important that we do work and that we start doing work, if in the form of, therapy, journaling, coaching, what have you, with regards to our own upbringings, especially if we feel like they've been difficult. I think that can be really profound, really healing. And I know for a lot of my clients, things that we've unearthed in our coaching work together, whether that's one-on-one or in my group program, it has shown them parts of themselves that need attending to. It has shown them issues within their relationship with their own parent or parents that they need to work through before they feel like they can really properly address the kids or child-free decision. Now, something that I thought was really interesting, not surprising, and I'll tell you why it's not surprising, but is the fact that Astrid sharing about her experience, sharing about it in the context of with her friends and family, but sharing about it publicly has been very, very, I'm using my word, not hers, but healing for her. She may have said that. I don't want to put words in her mouth because I don't recall, but she did talk about how it's been an important part of this journey, and that for her sharing authentically, her using her own name, it felt like a non-negotiable. She needed to do this and needed to share in this way. And I talk about how I'm not surprised that it was powerful because I think when we bring these feelings of shame to the light, vulnerability, whatever is going on for us in our lives, whether it relates to being on the fence about kids. So in the case of me, for example, being on the fence about kids and talking about that, or perhaps for yourselves, there's been some it's been a solve for you to come to a workshop or to have discussion with other women about your indecision. In Astrid's case, of course, talking about regretting motherhood. For other people, whatever it is we've been through, I know personally and I know professionally through my coaching work, just how powerful and liberating it can be to, again, bring these sort of shadow parts of ourselves to the light and to realize there's nothing wrong. There's nothing we need to be ashamed of. And what happens is so often a validation from other people who feel the same way. And I love that she is using this source of pain in her life and the regret she feels to be able to connect with and support other women. And she shares just how powerful and meaningful this work has been to her. Where Astrid refers to one particular message she had gotten with a woman saying, "This literally saved my life." And she thought, my work here is done. It's a very emotional and moving thing to know that you quite literally have played a role in someone deciding to stay here on this earth. So, wow, I just thought, if any of you listening to this have an area of your life where you feel shame, where you feel different, where you feel other, to have the bravery to begin speaking about that can be such an incredible healing thing. All right, I have a very important invitation to make, and that is to join us for one of our upcoming Kids or Child-Free workshops. If you have not attended one of these 2-hour workshops and you are unsure whether you should have kids or stay child-free, this is the next thing on your to-do list to getting clear on the right choice for you. Head to kidsorchildfree.com. I will also link to our workshop page in the show notes and get all the details on this 2-hour live online workshop that's going to help you get more clarity and direction in terms of whether a future with kids or a future without them is the right path for you. Tickets are only $45 and we have these workshops every month or two, so you should be able to find a date and time that works for you. If you can't join the upcoming date, make sure you sign up for emails so that you can get notified when the next date is announced. Now, something that I guess I want to say it surprised me, but maybe it didn't, was just how much she generally has not received judgment about sharing about her regret. And she does say, there's certain comments on social media and news publications, if she's been quoted somewhere or featured. I just don't read that, she says. But for the most part, and I think specifically about her connection, her support circle of girlfriends that she talks about having done her aqua size with, her aqua aerobics, that these women have been wonderful supports for her through this, have shown a lot of understanding. And so I did get messages from a number of you saying how much more understanding this has given you about this idea of motherhood regret, because I think even if we worry we might regret our decision, it's still hard to think like, how can someone regret having kids? We have such like a negative view of this and we feel like it must be so impossible to experience. So I love that she's opening the eyes of women on the fence, all sorts of folks, parents. I mentioned having a conversation with a relatively new parent about this, child-free folks alike, that it's helping us just have better understanding of each other, which what an incredible thing. This is the kind of world we need to be in, right? Understanding rather than casting judgment. And the other thing sort of off the back of that, I had one of you message me and say that this has helped me be more understanding of a particular friend of mine who has been experiencing something like this. And so it's nice to know there may be people in our life that if they share something like this, or if we suspect that they may be regretting their motherhood, that we can feel like we have understanding based on Astrid sharing so openly about her experience. One of the other things that stood out in this conversation and hopefully came as a relief to those of you thinking, oh my goodness, like this sounds really hard, which it certainly does, is that there is still joy in the relationship she has with her son. And as I've shared and as she shares in the episode, she talks about she loves her son deeply. And They seem to have a really beautiful relationship. And I love when she shares in the episode about this ritual they have on the weekend of watching a Pixar film together and, having takeout. And I just thought, like, what beautiful memories she's building with her son and with her family. And I love that there are still moments in her life, specifically of being a mom and with her son, that she finds really enjoyable and that she seems to be striving to create these kind of moments. And my hope is that in that sort of long game, that perhaps as her son gets older, there will be less a sense of regret and more meanings of joy. And as one listener put it, like, that regret is not the end of the story, right? That this is similar to us experiencing feelings of grief if we've gone through grief, or the overwhelm or anxiety of making this decision, that the regret doesn't need to be the end of the story. It would be really interesting for me to connect again with Astrid, even in a few years' time, just to see, have her feelings changed. And that's not to say that the regret is a fleeting state. It may be. It seems like it's certainly been present for the last several years of her son's life. But it would be interesting to see, like, where and how it resides in this experience and journey of motherhood. I guess one last thing that I want to just sort of underline that came through the conversation is the fact that change is possible. And although she still says, yes, I do regret motherhood, no, I would not have a child if I could choose again, that change is possible in the sense that she has done a lot of work. Her and her husband have done a lot of work to better their relationship, the teamwork of parenting, that, they continue to work on their family, that as she's come through difficult periods and times, like, change is the only constant, as we know, right? And so it is possible, I think, for these situations, if one of you were to find yourself feeling like you have regret about having chosen to have a child or children, that is, again, as I've just talked about, not the end of the road necessarily. All right. So I guess a few more personal takes on things. And these are just thoughts that enter my mind. I mean, I've been sharing a lot of thoughts that enter my mind, but perhaps more for you to digest or feedback that I've received from you. I want to get a little bit more in depth on this idea of regret. And I guess what I want to say, first of all, is I think we need to ask ourselves, what is my personal relationship with regret? I don't even know how to articulate this, but, like, am I a regretful person? And again, the implication is not that, well, Astrid is a regretful person, therefore she regrets motherhood. No, that's not what I want to say. But, like, are you someone who has typically regretted decisions in your life? Have you regretted past experiences? Have you, like, is this an emotion that you're familiar with? And I say I'm sharing a little bit more personally now, because for me personally, regret, or at least this word regret, is something that it's not very much present in my life or vocabulary, and it's not really in the past either, as far as, and I've probably talked about this before. Yes, I have made what we can say are not smart decisions. Yes, I have ultimately corrected course many times in my life. But the way I view it is that these have always been learning experiences. They've been necessary. They have shaped the person that I am. And I'm actually really grateful for them, because they've led to me being the person that I am today. Now, could we still say some of those things are regret if we look at regret as being the lens of, I wouldn't choose this again? Yeah, there's things I probably wouldn't choose again. But at the same time, I'm like, I don't know, but maybe I would, because I don't know if I'd be where I am today in my life, having learned the things that I have and the relationship that I'm in with the life that I have, if I hadn't have walked those various paths. So I just want to offer to you, like, spend some time thinking about regret, maybe writing down, when have I felt regretful in the past? What types of things do I typically regret? What does regret feel like in my body? Like, just thinking about your relationship with this word, with this emotion, with this experience, and to see or notice how it lands with you, because I think that may give us some clues about whether or not regret could possibly be in our future. And I'm sure Astrid will be listening to this episode, welcoming Astrid's thoughts on if there are times in her past that may have offered clues that maybe this is something she would regret, and perhaps not. But I do think it's an important question to ask ourselves. Another, I guess, more personal take is I just want to think about, like, how important the stories we tell ourselves about our experiences matter. And I think the thing is they matter a lot, right? And it can be so validating to be able to put words to something. Astrid talks about just how validating Ornadonath's book, Regretting Motherhood, was in terms of being able to give voice to, giving a word or a term to something that she had been experiencing. And so when I talk about, the stories we tell ourselves, and I want to just kind of elaborate a little bit more on what I mean about that. But what I want to say is it can be super important to say, this is me. I identify with this. This is what my experience has been. I also wonder, at what point is it perhaps less helpful or even detrimental to subscribe to a particular label or a broad, sort of identification? And allow me to sort of contrast this with an example. So I personally have struggled with chronic pain. This is something I think I've mentioned in a couple of podcast episodes. I've dealt with chronic pelvic pain, back pain, hip pain, that whole kind of region or area of the body. And I am very mindful that I don't like to say too much. I am a chronic pain sufferer. Chronic pain is it's who I am, if you will. And I'm not, again, implying that Astrid would say regretting motherhood or being regretful of motherhood is who I am. But I think it's easy for us, especially when we have words, labels, diagnoses that talk about who we are, to both have this feeling of, oh my gosh, this helps me so much to understand what's going on. And I also think that we can start to operate under and also even receive sort of an internal validation of this is who I am, right? And if not for this, then what am I? Another example is, for a long time with this chronic pelvic pain, part of it was due to endometriosis. And so for me, having received a firm diagnosis, them doing surgery and saying, yes, we found endometriosis, this is what's going on. Again, there's a lot of validation. There was such a feeling of relief. But I'm also mindful that I don't necessarily affix that to who I am. And to give an example, I sometimes see people I come across on Instagram, and it's I have ADHD, endometriosis, I am a chronic pain warrior, whatever it may be. And again, I do think, and this is why I say this is personal, I'm trying to, you can probably tell, be careful with my words, because I don't want to imply that if Astrid or any other person who's regretting motherhood were to say, to drop that label or identity of I regret motherhood, that would necessarily change things. But I'm also curious what it may do if that wasn't part of a constant reinforcement of, this is my story, this is what I'm going through. I don't, in my case, for example, want to go through the world every day being I suffer from chronic pain, I am in pain, I am pain. I try to keep it at arm's length and to reaffirm other things, right? So I wonder, as a contrast to this notion of regretting motherhood, if there may be a way, without invalidating anyone's experience, to say, I have gone through a difficult season. There are parts of motherhood I really don't enjoy. And yet, and to focus on, I don't want to say glass is being half full. I'm not trying to cast toxic positivity over this experience. But it's a thought I have. I'd love to hear from you. And of course, Astrid, if you're listening, I'd love to hear from you as well. Is there an opportunity to approach or have a different perspective on this experience that may be more helpful in the long term? I don't know. Okay. Just a thought that enters this coach's brain. Another question one of you asked is, they were curious, how much does personality play a role? And they were wondering, does Astrid see herself as, because of my traits, my makeup, my personality, I don't know, I'm introverted and I don't like this and I do like this and I tend to approach things this way. However Astrid might characterize herself, which, by the way, I don't know if she considers herself an introvert, but does that maybe play a role, and we could say predispose someone to potentially feeling regret, or more likely feeling regret? I don't know. That it's a good question. And I had to bring to mind a friend of mine, a dear friend of mine, who she's always struggled with flying, and specifically because she often doesn't sleep on long haul flights. I relate to that, by the way. I'm sure a lot of you do, although I've gotten quite a bit better at sleeping on planes because I stopped telling myself I'm someone who doesn't sleep on planes. And I'm being somewhat jestful, but that's actually part of it. I stopped telling myself at the time, I don't sleep on planes. I can't sleep on planes. I was like, yeah, I sometimes sleep. may not be my best sleep. I slept so much on a recent trip back from Canada that Chris had to laugh at me and say, like, I think you are someone who sleeps on planes. So that's my new story. I digress, though. This friend of mine struggles with long haul flights, has trouble sleeping. Often then when she doesn't sleep, feels terribly sick. She feels nauseous. She becomes quite grouchy and miserable. If you're listening and you know who you are, you probably would agree. I know you've told me this before. I mentioned that in terms of personality and temperament because she's somebody based on her makeup, her biology, the way she views the world. And I mean, we all need sleep, right? Some of us can manage better than others, though. You do wonder if there's like a constellation of factors, and it may not be personality. It could have to do with, our biology. It could have to do with genetics that may more likely predispose someone. Curious. I don't know. Maybe the likes of Orna Donath can do some research in the future to say, is there and you know what, maybe this exists. Maybe perhaps not in the kids or child-free or reproductive decision-making realm, but maybe there is something that's looked at people who are more likely to feel regret about their life's decisions. It would be interesting to know. All right, I think that is all. I'm really curious to hear what you thought of this recap, my personal assessment of our conversation. Again, we want to, I know all of you thank Astrid for coming on, for sharing so bravely. This is something that came through in your messages and comments. So brave, so courageous. Thank you so much, Astrid. Welcoming your further input, Astrid, and all of you on what I've shared today. If there's anything perhaps that I've missed that you felt came to mind, let's keep this conversation going. It certainly won't be the last conversation we have about regret. I would also love to have someone on who regrets choosing the child-free path. I don't want to play favorites here and just feel like I'm pushing one side of the story. So if you know anyone or you are someone who regrets choosing child-free, hit me up. We'll have you on the podcast to share your story. All right, that is all for me. Thank you so much for tuning in today. As always, if you can please make sure to leave a review. We are getting close to, in mid-January, it will hit our 1-year anniversary of the Kids or Child-Free podcast. So I would love to do a bit of a push right now and over the coming weeks to see if we can hit 200 5-star reviews on Spotify. Can we do it? Can we grab some more beautiful reviews and ratings on Apple Podcasts? Depending where you're listening right now, if you haven't already done so, I love when you finish listening to the words coming out of my mouth. If you could leave us a 5-star rating, if you love what you're hearing, if you can leave us some kind words, which you can do only on the Apple Podcast app, not on Spotify, that is going to help us get discovered by more listeners. That is going to help me to continue doing this work. That's going to help us attract even more fantastic guests to the podcast. So thank you in advance for doing so. I want to wish you a wonderful rest of the day. I really appreciate you being here, and I hope to see you back here soon.